I came home 3 hours early that Thursday. The bedroom light was on when I turned into the parking garage. Then it suddenly went dark. I sat there with my hands still on the wheel engine ticking as it cooled, and told myself there was a simple explanation. There's always a simple explanation right up until there isn't. 17 years in the army teaches you that instinct and evidence are two different things, and only one of them holds up in a debrief. So I didn't move. I just watched the window, waiting for the light to come back on, waiting for the story my mind was already writing to prove itself wrong. It didn't. My name is Sophie Harrington. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, 38 years old. And until that Thursday evening in October, I would have told you, my marriage was one of the few things in my life that didn't require constant vigilance. 11 years with Daniel, not perfect whose marriage is, but solid. The kind of solid you stop checking on, because you assume the foundation is doing its job without you. I hadn't planned on being home early. A 4-0 briefing at Belvoir got cancelled when the readiness numbers came in clean for once. And instead of catching up on paperwork, I decided to surprise Daniel. Pick up Thai food from the place he liked on King Street. Walk in the door before he expected me, sit across from him at our kitchen island, and just talk the way we used to before his consulting work. Started eating every evening. He'd texted me around noon. Meeting a client tonight. Don't wait up. I hadn't thought twice about it. Commercial real estate development doesn't run on bankers' hours. And Daniel had explained this to me more times than I could count, the sidewalks that only work at dusk. The investors who only take calls after their own workday ends. I'd built a whole tolerance for his schedule, the same way I'd built tolerance for deployments and 12-hour shifts. You don't question the framework you live inside. You just live inside it. So when I pulled into the garage of our building that evening, container of pad see balanced on the passenger seat, I wasn't looking for anything. I was just a woman coming home to surprise her husband. That's the version of myself I want you to hold on to for a moment, because in less than 10 minutes she was gone. The habit of looking up at our window 4th floor corner unit, the one with the good afternoon light Daniel always complained, kept him up too early. On weekends was so automatic I barely registered doing it. The bedroom light was on. That alone meant nothing. Daniel could have come home before his meeting to change, grab something, take a call in private. Then as I watched, the light went out. Not a fade, not a dimmer switch easing down, a flat immediate darkness. The kind that happens when someone flips a switch fast, because they don't want to be seen standing in the light anymore. I didn't pull into my usual spot. I don't fully know why. Some part of me, that had spent nearly 2 decades reading rooms before walking into them, took over before my conscious mind caught up. I parked in a visitor space near the garage entrance, angled where I could see the elevator bank, but stay half hidden behind a concrete pillar. And I turned off my engine. Then I waited 7 minutes. I know because I watched them pass on the dashboard clock, each one longer than the last. My chest tight in a way I didn't want to name yet. The garage was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system, and somewhere above my car alarm chirping once as someone locked their doors. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. I kept not starting my engine and driving up to our assigned spot like a woman with nothing to hide from her own home. Then the elevator chimed, the doors opened, and a woman stepped out. For 1 full second, my brain simply refused the information coming through my eyes, because the woman getting off that elevator wearing a soft gray jacket, I recognized instantly. I'd seen it draped over the back of a chair in my own dining room the previous Sunday, was my sister. Claire. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look like someone sneaking out of a building. She walked toward the exit at an ordinary pace, pulling her phone from her bag, checking something on the screen the way anyone does when they're leaving, anywhere. Completely at ease, completely unaware that 15 feet away behind a concrete pillar, her sister was sitting in a parked car, unable to breathe. I told myself there had to be a reason. Claire lived across town. Maybe she'd come to drop something off. Maybe she'd been visiting a friend in the building. My mind kept manufacturing explanations the way it had been trained to for years. The same instinct that had let me overlook Daniel's late nights, that had let me trust without asking follow-up questions, because asking follow-up questions of the people you love felt like an insult to the love itself. Then Daniel walked out of the elevator about a minute after Claire, just enough distance that if anyone in that garage had glanced up, glanced at security footage, glanced at anything, the two of them wouldn't have looked connected. He wasn't rushing either. He had that same unhurried, confident walk I'd fallen in love with at a mutual friend's wedding 11 years earlier. The walk of a man who never doubted he belonged exactly where he was standing. He didn't look toward Claire, who was now near the exit gate. He didn't look toward my car because he had no reason to think I was there. He simply walked to the elevator bank one more time, pressed a button, and disappeared back upstairs. I sat in that garage for a long time after both of them were gone. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't storm up to our apartment and demand an explanation, though every instinct I had screamed at me to do exactly that. Instead, I looked down at the dashboard clock one final time. 6:17 p.m. I don't know why I needed to memorize it, except that some part of me already understood I would need it later. A fixed point to build a timeline from the way we build timelines for anything that needs to survive scrutiny. That was the moment my marriage ended. Daniel just didn't know it yet. I pulled out of that garage before Daniel could come back down and see my car parked where it shouldn't have been. My hands were steady on the wheel, in a way that surprised me. I've noticed that about myself over the years. The worse things get, the calmer my body becomes. Like some old training kicks in beneath the panic and takes the wheel for me. I drove 4 blocks and parked outside a coffee shop I'd never been to before. One with a name I didn't bother reading. I needed somewhere that wasn't home, wasn't the base, wasn't anywhere I'd have to perform normally for another human being. I sat in a corner booth with a coffee I didn't drink and made myself do the one thing that had kept me alive. Through 2 deployments and a dozen difficult decisions in uniform. Separate what I felt from what I actually knew. What I knew was small. Claire had left our building. Daniel had left a minute later. The bedroom light had gone dark right before Claire appeared. That was it. That was the entire evidentiary record. Everything else, the tightening in my chest, the sick certainty settling into my stomach, was feeling, not fact. And feeling wasn't something I could act on yet. But once I let myself sit still with it, the small things I'd been filing away without noticing began rising to the surface uninvited. Claire had started coming to more family dinners over the past 6 months. Nothing dramatic, just enough that I'd mentioned to Daniel once, almost fondly. How nice it was that she and I were growing closer again. Daniel had known more about Claire's financial troubles than I would have expected a brother-in-law to know details about her rent, her car payment things she'd never mentioned to me directly. Once months ago, at a dinner I'd half listened to while checking work email, Claire had looked at Daniel and said, "You're honestly the only one who really gets me." And I remembered, it was a strange thing to say, with your sister sitting 3 feet away, and then forgetting it within the hour because nothing about it seemed to warrant more than a passing thought. And the phone Daniel had changed his passcode 4 months ago. When I'd asked why, half joking, he'd said something about a work security policy, new client confidentiality requirements. I hadn't questioned it, because questioning felt like an accusation, and I didn't have anything to accuse him of. Not then. The client dinners had also increased. Not dramatically, not all at once. The kind of gradual shift you only notice in hindsight when you finally sit down and actually count. I got home at 8:40. I made myself walk through our door like a woman who'd spent the evening running errands, not a woman who'd spent 40 minutes memorizing a stranger's coffee shop ceiling while trying not to fall apart. Daniel got home at 9:15. He kissed my cheek, dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, the same bowl we'd bought together in our first apartment 15 years ago, before we were even engaged. "Client dinner ran long," he said, already heading toward the kitchen for a glass of water, already narrating his evening, as if nothing about it required narrating. "Good meeting?" I asked. My voice came out even. I was almost proud of it. "Very," he said, and smiled at me over the rim of the glass. That smile did something to me that seeing Claire in the garage hadn't. Watching my sister step off an elevator had been shock. This was different. This was watching a man I'd shared a bed with for 11 years lie to my face, without a flicker of hesitation, without his voice catching, without anything in his body language betraying the smallest discomfort. He was good at it. That was the part that scared me. Not that he'd lied, but how easily. I didn't confront him. Not that night, not the next morning. I want to be honest about why it wasn't patience exactly, and it wasn't fear either. It was the recognition that if I said something now, based only on what I'd seen, Daniel would have a full day to build an explanation before I even had a full picture of what needed explaining. I'd spent my career learning not to move on incomplete information. I wasn't going to abandon that now, when it mattered more than it ever had. So instead, over the following 2 days, I did the only thing available to me that was both legal and honest. I looked at what I already had every right to see: our joint bank account, our shared credit card, the household bills that came to both our names. Nothing hidden, nothing accessed without permission, just a wife looking at her own financial life with clearer eyes than she'd used in years. What I found didn't look like an affair. It looked like something worse. Over 8 months, thousands of dollars had moved out of our joint account in a pattern I hadn't tracked closely before, each transfer labeled by Daniel when I'd asked about individual charges in passing as business expenses. I'd never pushed. He handled the deal-related spending. I handled the household side. It was a division of labor that had made sense when I trusted the person on the other end of it completely. One transfer stopped me cold. $18,500 sent to an LLC. I had never heard of a name that meant nothing to me appearing on our statement, like it had always belonged there. I went back through the folder of documents Daniel kept in our shared filing cabinet paperwork, from an investment restructuring he'd asked me to sign off on nearly a year earlier, something he described at the time as routine. The company name surfaced again in those papers, and beside it, listed as the mailing address for correspondence, was an address I recognized instantly because I'd driven to it every holiday for the past 3 years. It was Claire's address. I sat at our kitchen table, with those papers spread in front of me, the apartment silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, and understood that whatever I'd stumbled into in that parking garage was not simply an affair. Daniel and Claire were hiding something from me that involved money, and it had been going on for a long time. I called Rachel Kim on a Tuesday morning before physical training, sitting in my car in the base parking lot with the engine running for heat. Rachel and I had been friends since our first year at Georgetown, back when she was pre-law and I was already deep into ROC. Two very different women who somehow understood each other completely. She'd built a civil litigation practice over the past decade, sharp and methodical in a way that made her terrifying in a deposition and steady in a crisis. I needed steady more than anything else. That morning, I told her everything: the garage, the light, Claire stepping off that elevator in the jacket. I recognized the $18 to $500, the LLC with Claire's address on it. I didn't dress any of it up, and I didn't fall apart while I said it. Though my voice did catch once on the word sister, in a way I hadn't expected. Rachel didn't rush to comfort me, which I was grateful for. She's a lawyer before she's anything else. And in that moment, I needed the lawyer. I asked her one question, the only one that actually mattered. If my marriage ends tomorrow, what do I need to do today so I don't hurt myself in the process? She gave it to me straight. Don't access Daniel's private email or phone without authorization. Anything I found that way would be worthless in court and could expose me to liability of my own. Don't secretly move money out of the joint accounts or start liquidating anything. A judge would read that as bad faith, and it would undercut every legitimate claim I had. Don't post anything anywhere about what I suspected. Don't confront Daniel until I understood the full financial picture, because confrontation without leverage just gives the other side time to cover their tracks. You already did the hard part. Rachel said. You didn't react. Most people would have gone up to that apartment and blown the whole thing up in the garage. You didn't. Keep doing that. So, I did. Over the following week, I built what Rachel called a clean record. Legally accessible statements backed up properly. Organized by date. Every joint account transaction for the past year printed and highlighted. A timeline, the kind I'd built 100 times for after-action reports. Except this time the subject was my own marriage. The deeper I went, the worse the picture became. Almost a year earlier, Daniel had asked me to sign paperwork related to what he called a restructuring of one of his investment projects. I remembered the conversation clearly. Now sitting at this same kitchen table, Daniel sliding documents across to me, saying it was mostly procedural, something about liability protections for a development deal he was consulting on. I'd trusted him. I'd barely read past the signature lines, because why would I have read closely? He was my husband. He'd never given me a reason to read closely. Reading it now with different eyes, I saw what I'd missed. Daniel had used a portion of assets tied to our shared finances, not directly withdrawn, but leveraged, used as informal backing to help secure his position in a small real estate investment, a property purchase and renovation project, the kind of flip he'd talked about wanting to do for years, always as some hypothetical future plan we'd discuss someday. That LLC, the one with Claire's address on it, it wasn't just receiving a transfer from us. Claire was listed as a partial owner. Our money that existed inside my marriage, built partly from my own salary, my own deployments, my own years of service, was helping fund a project my sister had a stake in alongside my husband, without my knowledge or consent. And then I found the text message. It surfaced on our shared phone bill, an itemized record I almost never looked at, closely buried in a printout of the past several months. Not the message itself, just the fragment visible in the metadata line, where Daniel had at some point saved it as a note or forwarded it, leaving a trace I could still make out in the billing description. Daniel to Claire 4 months earlier, once everything closes, will finally have options. Options. I sat with that word for a long time. I understood exactly what it meant, the way you understand a diagnosis, before the doctor finishes the sentence. Daniel wasn't just sleeping with my sister. He was building an exit funded, at least in part, by resources tied to the marriage he intended to leave. A future life quietly under construction, financed by the present one he hadn't yet admitted was ending. I set the papers down and made myself breathe slowly, the way I'd trained soldiers half my age to do before a difficult call, not because I was calm, because I needed to be. My phone rang an hour later. Claire. Her voice was completely ordinary, warm, even like nothing in the world was wrong. Mom wants us all over for Sunday dinner. You and Daniel coming? I looked across the room at Daniel sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, utterly unaware of what was spread across our kitchen table 20 feet away. He glanced up, caught my eye, smiled the same easy smile he'd given me over that glass of water days earlier. I held the phone a little tighter. Of course, I said. I wouldn't miss it. Margaret's house hadn't changed in the 15 years since I'd moved out. Same navy shutters, same brass door knocker, shaped like a pineapple that she insisted was a symbol of hospitality. Same smell of rosemary and roasted chicken drifting out before you even reach the porch. I used to find that consistency comforting. That Sunday, walking up the front steps with Daniel beside me, it felt like walking onto a stage set for a performance I hadn't agreed to be part of. Claire was already there when we arrived, sitting at the kitchen island, with a glass of white wine, laughing at something on her phone. She stood up when she saw me, and wrapped her arms around me, like nothing in the world had shifted between us. Like I hadn't spent the past week building a timeline with her name written across the top of it. You look tired, she said, pulling back to study my face. Everything okay at work? Busy season, I said. That was when I caught it faint underneath her perfume. A note I recognized instantly, and had spent 2 weeks convincing myself I'd imagined. I'd smelled it on our pillowcase one night nearly a month ago, brief and gone by morning, and I'd told myself it was nothing. Some product Daniel had picked up, some scent that clung to hotel linens after a business trip. Standing 3 feet from Claire in our mother's kitchen, I understood I hadn't imagined anything at all. Dinner started the way it always did. Margaret at the head of the table asking about my work in a tone that suggested she still wasn't entirely sure what a lieutenant colonel did all day. Daniel charming her, the way he always managed to refilling her wine before she asked. I watched all of it now with a different kind of attention. I watched Daniel and Claire specifically, how carefully they avoided looking at each other, how that avoidance was its own kind of evidence, more obvious to me now than if they'd stared at each other openly. Margaret brought up Claire's plans without any awareness of what she was stepping into. Claire's got some big business opportunity in the works, she said proudly, reaching for the green beans. She won't tell me details yet, but I can tell it's got her excited. Daniel changed the subject so fast it was almost impressive. Something about a Nationals game, a completely manufactured interest in baseball that he'd never once expressed in 11 years of marriage. Margaret, delighted by any conversation that didn't require follow-up questions, took the bait immediately. I said nothing. I ate my dinner and watched my family perform a version of normal that none of them apparently realized I could see straight through. After the plates were cleared, Claire found me in the kitchen, drying dishes I didn't need to dry, clearly looking for a moment alone. She leaned against the counter with the particular posture of someone working up to something. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Don't take this the wrong way." "Okay. Sometimes I look at your life and I wonder what it would feel like. You've got the career, the marriage, the house. It's like you've never had to fight for any of it." I set the dish towel down slowly. There was a version of me a week earlier who would have taken that comment at face value. An insecure younger sister comparing herself unfavorably, needing reassurance. That version of me might have said something kind. Might have told her she had plenty going for her. That comparison was pointless, that I loved her. I wasn't that version of myself anymore. "Maybe you already know," I said, and watched her face change. For a moment, Claire's easy confidence cracked completely. A flicker of something close to panic, behind her eyes gone almost as fast as it appeared. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, ask something, and I turned and walked back into the dining room before she had the chance. I didn't need her answer. I already had it. That night, back at our apartment, Daniel seemed unsettled in a way I hadn't seen from him before, checking his phone more than usual. Quieter than his usual easy self. Around 11, lying in bed with the lights off, he finally asked, "Everything okay with you?" His voice had none of its usual confidence in it. "Everything's becoming very clear," I said, and turned onto my side, facing away from him. By morning, something in him had shifted further. He made coffee before I woke up, something he almost never did. He suggested almost too casually that we take a long weekend somewhere warm, somewhere we hadn't been in years, just the two of us reconnecting. He said the words, "just the two of us," twice, like repetition would make them truer. I recognized this for what it was, not romance, fear wearing romance's clothing, a man who suspected the ground shifting beneath him and was trying to steady it the only way he knew how, by performing the marriage he'd been quietly abandoning for months. I told him a weekend away sounded nice. I meant none of it, and some part of me suspects he didn't fully believe himself either. But before I filed anything, before I let Rachel move a single document forward, there was one thing I still needed to understand. Not for the divorce, for myself. How much did Claire actually know about the money? Whether she'd walked into this as a woman in love who'd gotten in over her head, or as someone who'd known exactly what she was helping Daniel take from me, dollar by dollar, for the better part of a year. I intended to find out. I didn't need to trap Daniel into anything. That was the thing I came to understand about him during those weeks. He'd always been a man who talked himself into trouble if you gave him a quiet enough room and enough time. I didn't have to manufacture a confrontation. I just had to create the conditions for the truth to surface on its own, and then be patient enough to let it. One evening, about 10 days after that Sunday dinner, I brought it up over dinner, as casually as I could manage. I told him I'd been reviewing our long-term financial planning, true in its way, and that I wanted to update the ownership paperwork on the apartment, get everything properly documented, while I was already deep in our finances for other reasons I didn't specify. Daniel's reaction was immediate and disproportionate to what should have been a mundane administrative conversation. "Why would we change anything now?" he said, setting his fork down harder than the moment called for. "Because I paid the down payment," I said, keeping my voice level. Remember, he went quiet. It was a small silence, maybe 3 seconds. But I'd spent 11 years learning the difference between Daniel's ordinary pauses and the ones that meant something had landed somewhere he didn't want it to. This detail mattered more than it might have sounded. The original down payment on our apartment had come from an inheritance I'd received from my grandmother, money that was legally mine before it ever touched our marriage. Over the years since we'd both contributed to the mortgage, to renovations, to the accumulated weight of a shared home, which meant the honest answer to whose house is it required lawyers, not assumptions on either side. I want to be clear about that because I never told myself a simpler story than the truth. I didn't walk around assuming the apartment was mine outright. I just knew, watching Daniel's face in that moment, that he'd apparently been telling someone else a very different story. The next day, Claire called me unprompted, her voice light, working hard to sound like she was asking nothing in particular. "Are you guys thinking about selling the apartment or anything?" she asked, somewhere in the middle of a conversation about nothing dropped in like it belonged there. I understood immediately what I was looking at. Daniel had promised Claire something he had no clear right to promise: a future built on an asset whose ownership wasn't even settled between the two people whose names were actually on the mortgage. He'd been telling her a story about what would be available to them once things closed, to use his own word, without any real claim to make that story true. "Why do you care what happens to my home?" I asked her. There was a pause on the line, longer than the one Daniel had given me the night before. When Claire spoke again, something in her had lost its footing, Daniel said. She stopped herself. I heard her breath catch, heard her realize, half a second too late, exactly what she'd started to reveal. Daniel said what I asked. The line went dead. She'd hung up on me rather than finish the sentence, which told me more than finishing it would have. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment after that call ended, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere in the space between them. Claire hanging up like that wasn't an accident. It was fear, the same fear I'd started to recognize in Daniel. The fear of two people who'd built something on a foundation they knew somewhere underneath all their justifications wasn't actually theirs to build on. I called Rachel that same afternoon and told her everything: the down payment conversation, Claire's call, the half sentence she hadn't been able to finish. Rachel didn't need to hear more. "You have enough," she said. "Not to win an argument at your kitchen table, to move forward properly." Over the following days, Rachel and I moved the divorce filing from a hypothetical into something real. Every financial document I'd gathered got organized into a formal record. The transfers, the LLC, the down payment history, all of it prepared to be handled the way these things are supposed to be handled, through process, rather than through shouting matches in a kitchen. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, and I found a strange comfort in that. The same comfort I've always found in doing things correctly. Even when doing them correctly is slower than doing them out of pure emotion would have been. Daniel still didn't know any of this was happening. He spent that week trying harder than I'd seen him try in years. Small gestures, unprompted affection. A version of himself I hadn't seen since the earliest part of our marriage, before either of us had learned how comfortable silence could become inside a relationship. I understood what was happening. Even as it was happening, he'd felt something shift after the down payment conversation, and whatever instinct he had left was telling him to close the distance before it became unbridgeable. The evening he came home with flowers, I was already sitting at the kitchen table, the folder from Rachel's office closed in front of me, waiting. He set the flowers down on the counter, white ranunculus, the kind I used to love before I stopped noticing whether I loved anything he gave me, and I looked at them and then at him and felt the strangest calm settle over the whole room. "We need to talk," I said. I placed the folder on the table between us and slid it toward him without a word. Daniel looked down at it, then at me, and I watched him try to read my face the way you'd read a commanding officer before a briefing you already suspected was bad news. "What is this?" he asked, though something in his voice told me he already had a guess. "Open it," I said. He didn't. For a moment, he just stood there, flowers still in one hand, forgotten. I didn't reach for dramatics. I didn't raise my voice. 11 years of marriage and 17 years of service had taught me the same lesson from two different directions. The moments that matter most are rarely the loud ones. Thursday, I said, 6:17 p.m. The parking garage. His face changed. Not all at once. First confusion, genuine for half a second, then the slow drain of color, as he understood exactly what I was describing. Claire came down first, I continued. You waited about a minute before you followed her out, long enough that anyone watching wouldn't have connected you, except I was watching. He set the flowers down on the counter, finally carefully, like the gesture required more concentration than it should have. Then he did what people do when the truth becomes impossible to outrun. He started explaining instead of denying. He said the marriage had gone cold. He said I'd always put the army first, that there were years he'd felt like a placeholder in his own home, waiting for me to come back from one deployment or another, with enough of myself left over to actually be present. Some of what he said wasn't entirely wrong, and I let him say it because I wasn't interested in arguing with him about the emotional architecture of our marriage. I was interested in one thing. How long? I asked. He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might still try to minimize it, shrink it down into something smaller and more forgivable. But something in my expression must have told him that wouldn't work, because he finally said it plainly. About 8 months. 8 months. I did the math without meaning to. 8 months of Sunday dinners of Claire's jacket in our dining room of client meetings that ran late of a passcode I'd never questioned. 8 months of a life I thought I understood running in parallel with one I hadn't known existed. Then I opened the folder myself and turned it toward him. The LLC paperwork, the 18,500 transfer, the restructuring documents he'd asked me to sign nearly a year earlier, the ones I'd trusted without reading closely. I watched something in him shift again, and this shift was different from the first. This wasn't the fear of a man caught in an affair. This was the fear of a man realizing his wife understood the money. That's an investment, he said quickly. That's not what you're making it sound like. Then you can explain every dollar of it, I said through our attorneys. I placed the divorce filing on top of the folder. He stared at it for a long moment without touching it, and then something in him broke loose. Not sadness, not yet, but anger, sudden and defensive. The anger of a man who'd been telling himself a story, where he was still somehow the reasonable one. You're going to blow up our whole family over this, he said. You understand that everything gone, because you couldn't just talk to me. I didn't raise my voice to answer him. I didn't need to. I didn't destroy our marriage, Daniel, I said. I just stopped financing the lie. He didn't have a response to that. I'm not sure there was one to give. What followed in the weeks after wasn't loud and it wasn't cinematic. It was paperwork, mostly attorneys reviewing the joint accounts, the transfers, the LLC, all of it. Entering a process that moved at its own careful pace, the kind of pace Rachel had warned me it would take. Daniel found himself unable to move or sell any of the disputed assets while everything was under review, which meant the real estate project he and Claire had built together started to lose the one thing. It actually depended on certainty. Investors don't like uncertainty. Neither, it turns out, do the people whose relationships were built, partly on the promise of shared money, that was never as available as they'd assumed. Claire, from what I understood later, realized somewhere in that period that Daniel had overstated both the funds and the ownership stake he'd have once the divorce was finalized. Whatever future they'd been picturing together had been built in part on numbers that didn't hold up. The two of them, I heard, started blaming each other for what the whole thing had cost. But the moment that actually stayed with me happened at Margaret's house, not at any lawyer's office. Claire had gone to our mother first, apparently framing the situation as Sophie trying to destroy her life out of jealousy or control. Margaret called and asked me to come over, said the word family, the way she always did when she wanted me to absorb something so the peace could stay intact. I brought the timeline not to humiliate Claire, just so my mother would finally have the truth, instead of whatever version had been handed to her first. Margaret read through it at her kitchen table. The dates, the transfers, the messages, her face growing stiller with every page. When she finished, she looked up at Claire, who was standing near the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. "You were sleeping with your sister's husband?" Margaret said slowly while taking money out of their marriage. Claire didn't answer. The silence answered for her. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother didn't turn to me and ask me to be the bigger person. She didn't ask me to forgive, to smooth things over, to carry the weight so everyone else could stay comfortable. She just sat there holding the pages, looking at Claire like she was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. 9 months passed between that night at the kitchen table and the day I signed the final settlement. I want to be honest about what that settlement actually looked like, because I know some of you watching have been waiting for a version where I walk away with everything, and Daniel is left with nothing but the clothes on his back. That's not what happened. And I've made a kind of peace with that. The attorneys did their work. The assets were divided according to what the law actually said, not according to what either of us felt we deserved in our angriest moments. I kept what was legally mine, the inheritance that had started the down payment, my portion of what we'd built together. Honestly, I was released from any obligation tied to the project Daniel and Claire had constructed behind my back, which mattered more to me than any dollar amount could have. I didn't want a piece of something I'd never agreed to be part of. I wanted out of it entirely clean. Daniel ended up selling off portions of other investments to meet what the settlement required of him. The development project with Claire, the one that had been quietly funded in part by our marriage, never recovered its footing once the money became uncertain. And the trust between the two of them became even more uncertain than that. I heard, through the kind of family channels that never fully close, even when you want them to, that it collapsed within the year. What struck me more than the financial outcome was what happened to Daniel and Claire themselves. I think some part of me had expected that whatever they had would survive the wreckage, that it would prove to have been real underneath all the deception, a genuine thing that had simply chosen a dishonest way to exist. It wasn't. Once the secrecy that had been holding it together disappeared, once there was no longer anything to sneak around, nothing left to hide, no future asset to plan toward, there wasn't much left standing between them. Whatever they'd called love had been fed mostly by concealment and by the idea of a life that was never actually available to them. Take that away, and there was very little underneath it. Claire moved out of state within the year. I don't know all the details of her life now, and I've stopped trying to track them. My relationship with my mother didn't end, but it changed permanently in a way I think was overdue by about 2 decades. I didn't cut her off. I didn't deliver some speech about everything she'd asked me to swallow over the years, in the name of keeping the peace. I simply stopped absorbing things I didn't need to absorb. Months later, sitting in her kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, she said something to me I don't think I'll forget. "I spent years asking you to be the bigger person," she said, "because you were the stronger daughter. Being stronger," I told her, "doesn't mean accepting more disrespect." I don't know if she fully understood what I meant in that moment, but I saw something register in her face, some small recalibration that told me the words had landed somewhere real. I moved out of the old apartment once the property matters were finally resolved. I didn't want to live inside a space that had absorbed that much history. I found a smaller townhouse closer to base, simpler than what Daniel and I had built together, but entirely mine in every sense that mattered. A few weeks after I moved in, I came home late from a long day at the office. Nothing dramatic, just one of those days that stretches longer than it should. I pulled into my driveway and out of habit, some old reflex I hadn't managed to unlearn yet, I looked up toward my bedroom window. The light was on. For one full second, my stomach dropped the way it had. That Thursday evening, so many months earlier, my body remembering something my mind had mostly made peace with. I sat there in the car for a moment, waiting almost instinctively for the light to go dark, for some new betrayal to reveal itself the way the last one had. It didn't go dark. It just stayed on steady, because I was the only one who lived there, and I'd simply left it on that morning without thinking about it. There was no one hiding inside. No lie waiting behind the door for me to discover it later, piece by piece over weeks of quiet investigation. Just my own home exactly as I'd left it. I went inside, set my keys down on the counter, and turned on another lamp in the living room. Just because I could. Just because there was no one left to ask permission from, and no one left to hide anything from either. For months, I thought the worst moment of my life was watching that bedroom light go dark. I was wrong. That was the first moment I finally began to see clearly. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you'd have done in that garage. Would you have waited the way I did, or would you have gone straight upstairs? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Tonight, it means more to me than you probably realize to know these stories are reaching you. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you. So, if this found you at the right moment, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking through these. The photo stayed on my screen for 11 seconds before Claire deleted it. 11 seconds was long enough. Long enough to see my husband sitting in a hospital chair with a newborn on each arm. Long enough to read the caption underneath, "They finally have their daddy," and long enough to understand that the life I thought I was packing my bags for no longer existed. I didn't scream. I didn't drop my phone. I just sat very still on the edge of our bed, surrounded by the folded uniforms I'd laid out for tomorrow's flight, and felt something in my chest go quiet in a way that scared me more than any deployment ever had. That was the moment my marriage ended. Everything after was just paperwork. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of ordinary Sunday I'd had 100 times before. Laundry running garrison cap on the dresser, my duffel half packed for the drive back to post the next morning. I was a lieutenant colonel with 11 years in. And if there was one thing the Army had taught me, it was how to function when the ground shifted under me. So, when the text came in from my sister, I did what I'd trained myself to do in any crisis. I didn't react. I looked. The picture was gone before I could screenshot it, but 11 seconds is enough to burn something into memory. Ethan in a blue hospital gown chair, grinning down at 2 infants like a man who just won something. Claire's caption underneath, tender and proud. The kind of thing you write about your own child, not your sister's husband. 9 years fell on me all at once. Ethan and I had wanted a baby almost from the start. We'd talked about it on our second date, half joking, both of us meaning it more than we let on. The wanting had turned into trying, and the trying had turned into appointments, blood draws, hormones injections I gave myself at the kitchen counter because I refused to let it interrupt dinner. 2 rounds of IVF. 1 pregnancy that ended at 9 weeks in a bathroom at Fort Belvoir, while Ethan was at a conference in Chicago. I remembered sitting in our car in a clinic parking lot once saying, "I'm sorry my body keeps failing us," and Ethan pulling me against his shoulder and saying, "We're in this together." I had believed him for 9 years. I had believed him. I called Claire. She didn't pick up. 5 minutes later, a text came in from Ethan instead, working late. "Don't wait up," 3 words shy of the truth. Sent like any other Sunday. I looked at it for a long time, then set the phone face down on the nightstand and finished folding my uniforms. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't call my mother. I didn't post anything. Didn't cry where anyone could see it. Didn't give either of them the satisfaction of watching me come apart. There's a principle they drill into you early in leadership training. Never make a major decision in the first 60 seconds of a crisis, because the first 60 seconds belong to adrenaline, not judgment. I'd used that principle to keep soldiers alive. I used it that night to keep myself intact. So, I saved the photo before it vanished from my recent files. I screenshotted the text, and the next morning, instead of driving back to post, I called a divorce attorney. It took 2 days to learn the shape of what I already knew in my gut. Ethan and my sister had been sleeping together for almost 2 years. Claire had just given birth to twins. Ethan believed without a shadow of doubt that they were his. The affair alone would have been enough to end us. What made it unbearable was Claire. She was the one who drove me home from the clinic after my second failed transfer. The one who sat on the edge of my bed while I cried into a pillow and said so gently. I still remember her voice doing it. Maybe some families are just meant to happen differently. She said that to me while she was carrying my husband's children. I met with the attorney, a former JAG officer named Daniel Reeves, who didn't waste time being sympathetic before being useful. "You're a field-grade officer," he told me, folding his hands on the desk between us. "Keep your command out of this unless it touches your duties directly. This is a marriage, not a court-martial. Handle it like a civilian through me." I agreed with him completely. This was not a mission. It was a failure, mine and Ethan's both, though only one of us had chosen to lie about it. I signed the initial paperwork that Daniel drafted within the week. Before I left the house for the last time, I laid the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, where Ethan would see them the moment he walked in from work. I took off my wedding ring and set it on top of the stack, centered, deliberate, the way I'd learned to place things I wanted someone to notice without having to say a word about it. Then I picked up my bag and walked out to the car. I thought driving away that I had already absorbed the worst of it. I thought I understood exactly how deep the betrayal went. I had no idea that my mother-in-law had been holding a secret of her own for almost 9 years. One that would make everything I thought I knew about my marriage and about myself come apart all over again. I went back to post the next morning because that was the only place I still knew how to be steady. Nobody there needed to know that my marriage had ended over the weekend. Nobody there needed to know anything except that I could run a briefing, read a terrain map, and make a decision when it mattered. I'd built a career on being the person who didn't flinch, and for 1 week, that career was the only thing holding me together. I ran a training briefing in front of 40 soldiers that Tuesday without my voice shaking once. I signed off on a logistics report Wednesday morning with a steady hand. Nobody in that room could have told you that the woman standing at the podium had taken off her wedding ring 3 days earlier and left it on a kitchen counter like a piece of returned mail. It was only at night, back in the small off-post apartment I'd rented on short notice, that the discipline slipped. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and look at the faint pale line on my ring finger, the one 9 years of marriage had pressed into my skin. I want to be clear about something because I think people expect grief to look a certain way on someone like me. I wasn't unaffected. I wasn't made of stone. I simply refused to let Ethan be the one who decided how I would fall apart. That was mine to control, and I intended to keep it that way. Daniel started working through the marital assets that week. The house was in both our names. So was the retirement account. So was a modest investment portfolio we'd built slowly, over almost a decade of 2 incomes and careful budgeting. I want to be honest, I didn't go after everything I could have. I didn't try to strip Ethan bare out of spite. I asked Daniel for what was fair, what the law entitled me to, nothing engineered for punishment. Revenge, I was starting to understand, wasn't going to come from a spreadsheet. It was while gathering old records for Daniel that I found something that didn't sit right. Years earlier, during our fertility treatments, Dr. Hannah Pierce had asked Ethan to repeat a diagnostic test, something more detailed than the standard workup. I remembered the appointment vaguely filed away under 100 other appointments from that period. What I didn't have digging through our old medical folder was any record of the result. I remembered Ethan telling me almost offhand over dinner one night. Everything on my side came back normal, so the conversation and every appointment after turned toward me toward my hormone levels, my uterine lining my age. I had spent years believing, without ever being told outright, that the failure lived in my body. I didn't jump to conclusions. That's not how I operate. I called Dr. Pierce's office and requested whatever records I was legally entitled to from my own side of the treatment and asked carefully whether there was anything else on file that might explain the gap. Dr. Pierce wouldn't give me anything from Ethan's chart patient confidentiality, and she was right to hold that line. But something in her voice on the phone made me sit up straighter. "There were conversations back then that you weren't present for," she said. "Conversations with Ethan?" I asked, a pause longer than it should have been. "You need to ask Ethan about his own records." I hung up, not knowing what I'd just uncovered, only that there was something underneath the affair, something older, something that predated Claire entirely. I filed the thought away, the way I file everything uncertain. Not dismissed. Just waiting for more information. 2 nights later, my phone rang. Margaret. I almost let it go to voicemail. Ethan's mother and I had always had an easy relationship, warmer than most, and I wasn't ready to hear whatever version of an apology she might be working up to deliver on her son's behalf. But something in the second ring made me answer. Her voice was different from anything I'd heard from her before. Thin, frightened. Nora, she said, did Ethan ever tell you what happened after that second fertility evaluation? I went very still, phone pressed hard against my ear. What second evaluation? The silence on her end stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her breath catch, and a whisper that didn't sound like the composed, buttoned-up woman I'd known for 9 years. Oh, God, she said. Margaret asked me to meet her somewhere neutral, away from her house, away from anywhere Ethan might turn up. We settled on a small diner off Route 60 outside Richmond, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Han. I got there first and took a table in the back corner facing the door, an old habit I'd never bothered to break. She looked older than I remembered, not in the number of years, but in the way grief ages a face overnight. When she sat down across from me, she didn't ease into it. She didn't order coffee first or ask how I was holding up. She just said it. What my son did to you is indefensible. I want you to know that before anything else. I nodded and waited. That wasn't why she'd called me at 9 at night with her voice breaking. She told me the story slowly, like she was setting down something heavy she'd been carrying a long way. Almost 9 years ago, not long after Ethan and I started our fertility treatments, he'd gone in for a more detailed evaluation, the one Dr. Pierce had alluded to on the phone. The results came back, and they weren't what either of us had been told. Ethan had severe male factor infertility. Not zero chance the doctor had been careful to explain natural conception was possible, but unlikely, and further testing was recommended before anyone drew firm conclusions. It wasn't a door slammed shut. It was a door barely open. Ethan panicked. He drove straight to his mother's house that same afternoon and begged her not to say anything to me until he'd had time to get retested to be sure to understand what it meant before he had to say the words out loud to his wife. Margaret agreed to give him a few days. He never went back for the follow-up test. Instead, he came home to me and said the words I'd carried in my chest for almost a decade. Everything on my side came back normal. Margaret believed for a long time that he would eventually tell me the truth. He never did. She said the longer his silence went on, the harder it became to break. First weeks, then months, then years, until the lie had calcified into something that felt too large for either of them to touch. I asked her the questions in order, because that's how I process things that threaten to knock me sideways. One at a time, so nothing gets lost in the noise. You watched me blame myself, yes. You watched me go through 2 rounds of IVF, yes. And you knew there might have been a problem on his side the entire time. Her eyes were wet. Yes. I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't just the affair anymore. Ethan hadn't only betrayed our marriage with Claire. He had let me carry the weight of a failure that might never have belonged to me at all. And he had done it on purpose for 9 years, because he couldn't stand the idea of me looking at him differently. Margaret wasn't finished. When Claire had called to announce the pregnancy, Ethan phoned his mother, elated. I knew there was never anything wrong with me, he'd told her. Margaret asked carefully whether he planned to confirm anything, a paternity test, a follow-up with his doctor, anything. He'd gotten angry with her, instead, treating the pregnancy itself as proof that the old test had been wrong. Margaret was honest with me about the uncertainty. A low chance of conception isn't the same as 0. She couldn't tell me the twins weren't his. Nobody could not without a test, and she was careful not to hand me a conclusion dressed up as fact. All she knew for certain was what her son had chosen to hide, and from whom. I told her that was enough. Then he needs the whole truth. All of it, not just the part that's convenient for him. Before I left, Margaret slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a photocopy of a letter Ethan had written her not long after that first evaluation, back when he still thought he might tell me himself. One line stopped my breath entirely. Don't tell Nora until I know for sure. She already thinks this is her fault. Let her believe that a little longer. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully along its original crease and put it in my bag because some sentences you don't need to reread a third time. Once is enough to understand exactly how long a little longer turned out to be. 9 years. 9 years of blaming a body that had done nothing wrong, because the man who slept beside me every night had decided his own comfort was worth more than my truth. Ethan didn't know yet that I had the letter. He knew I'd found out about the affair. Knew the divorce of papers were already moving through Daniel's office. But he had no idea I'd sat across from his mother in a diner outside Richmond and read his own handwriting, telling her to let me believe a lie a little longer. As far as Ethan was concerned, I was simply the wife he'd wronged and was now working to move past. His texts came in waves that week, and I watched the tone shift the way water changes color when something's bleeding into it. It started apologetic. I never meant to hurt you like this. By day 3, it had drifted into justification. Claire understands what I've been through in a way you never really could. By day 5, it had become something else entirely. The twins changed everything. I finally have the family I always wanted. That last line told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. 9 years of marriage, a decade of appointments and losses I'd carried mostly alone. And somehow I was still cast as the obstacle between him and the family he felt entitled to. I didn't answer any of it. Some silences say more than an argument ever could. Claire, meanwhile, wanted legitimacy. She pushed Ethan to bring the twins to meet Margaret properly, to make the new arrangement feel like a family, instead of a scandal still finding its footing. Margaret told me later she'd refused at first. Then she changed her mind, not because she'd made peace with Claire, but because she'd decided somewhere in the days after our diner conversation that she was done protecting her son's silence. If he wanted to bring his new family home, he was going to do it in front of the truth. I want to be clear that I had no part in what happened that Saturday evening. I wasn't there. I didn't orchestrate anything. Didn't call ahead. Didn't set a trap. I've never believed in staging a man's downfall for an audience. Ethan then walked into that room entirely on his own, carrying the consequences of 9 years without knowing it. He arrived at his mother's house that evening, looking by Margaret's account prouder than she'd seen him in years. Claire came in beside him, holding one of the twins, Ethan, cradling the other against his chest like something he'd finally earned. He said it the way you'd announce a promotion. "Mom, meet your grandchildren." Margaret looked down at the baby in her son's arms, and something in her simply gave way. She told me afterward that it wasn't the baby's face that undid her. It was the memory that arrived behind it, unbidden all at once. The evaluation from 9 years ago. The hormone injections she'd once watched me give myself at her own kitchen table during a holiday visit, unwilling to let a treatment schedule interrupt a family dinner. The pregnancy that ended before it had a chance to become anything. And underneath all of it, her son's handwriting let her believe that a little longer. She went pale enough that Ethan noticed immediately. "Mom, what's wrong?" She didn't answer him right away. She looked at her son, then at Claire, then back at the baby, and something in her expression must have carried more weight than anything she could have said out loud, because the room went quiet, waiting for her to speak. "Wait," she finally said. "She didn't tell you." Ethan's face changed. "Tell me what Nora knows." "Knows what, Mom?" Margaret didn't answer him directly. Instead, she turned and walked into the small office off the hallway, the room she used for paying bills and keeping old photographs. And Ethan and Claire stood there in the living room, with 2 infants between them waiting. When Margaret came back, she was holding an envelope that had clearly been sealed and unsealed more than once over the years, its edges soft with age. She set it on the coffee table without a word. Ethan looked down at it, and I'm told his expression shifted the instant he recognized the handwriting on the front. It wasn't his mother's. It wasn't Claire's. It was his own. Margaret Claire's throat laid 3 things on the coffee table, one after another, like she was building a case she'd been assembling in her mind for 9 years without knowing it. First, a copy of the old evaluation results Ethan had shown her back when he still thought he might come clean. Second, the letter. His handwriting, his words. Third, a slip of paper with Dr. Pierce's office number on it, so Ethan could verify his own records if he doubted any of it. He read the letter, standing up, the baby still in his arms. And Margaret told me later that she watched the color drain out of his face line by line. Claire didn't understand yet what she was looking at. "What does that mean?" she kept asking, looking between Margaret and Ethan, her voice rising with each unanswered repetition. Ethan didn't answer her. Margaret wouldn't let him off that easily, either. She stood there and waited, arms crossed, until he had no choice but to say it out loud. He admitted it. Nearly 9 years earlier, he'd learned he had a serious fertility problem, one that needed further testing to fully understand. And instead of telling me, instead of letting us face it together the way we'd promised each other, we would face everything, he'd let shame make the decision for him. He'd grown up believing the way a lot of men do, that his ability to father a child was tangled up with his worth as one. He was afraid of how I'd look at him if he told me the truth. So, he let me believe quietly and completely that the failure belonged to me. Claire went still. Then, slowly, she looked down at the twins in her arms and Ethan's, and a different question started to form on her face. One that had nothing to do with old test results, and everything to do with the 2 children in the room. If Ethan had a serious fertility problem 9 years ago, how had she gotten pregnant with twins naturally without a single round of treatment? Ethan's answer came fast and defensive. "They're mine." Margaret didn't argue with him. She didn't need to. "Then confirm it," she said, and left it there. "I want to be honest about something here, because it would be easy for this story to tip into something less true than it actually was. Nobody in that room decided based on an old medical file that those children weren't Ethan's. A low chance of conception is not the same as no chance. Margaret knew that. I knew that when she told me. The only responsible thing left to do was find out for certain. And to Ethan's credit, once the confession was out, he didn't hide from that. He agreed to a paternity test. The days waiting for results were the ones that finally broke whatever was left between him and Claire. She told him something of her own during that stretch. That in the early months of their relationship, back before either of them had fully committed to what they were doing, she'd still occasionally seen her ex Ryan Mercer. She'd assumed the timing worked out in Ethan's favor. She'd never actually tested that assumption. She'd simply chosen to believe what was easiest. Ethan could barely speak. "You let me believe they were mine." Claire's answer landed harder than anything Margaret's letter had said. "You let Nora believe it was her fault for 9 years. I wasn't in the room." But Margaret repeated that line to me almost word for word, because she said it was the first time she'd watched her son hear his own behavior reflected back at him from someone else's mouth, and it silenced him completely. The results came back within the week. Ethan was not the father. There was no shouting. Margaret told me no scene out of daytime television. Ethan just sat down on the edge of the couch, still holding the folder, and didn't say anything for a long time. A man who had dismantled a 9-year marriage, chasing the family he believed he'd been owed, had just learned he hadn't bothered to confirm the most basic fact of it. But the real reckoning had nothing to do with DNA. It was quieter than that, and it landed somewhere deeper. Somewhere in that living room, Ethan finally understood what he'd actually thrown away. I had loved him enough once to face any diagnosis standing beside him. It was never my body that ended us. It was his fear, and the lie he built to protect it, that cost him the one thing he could never test his way back into. Ethan showed up at my apartment 3 days after the results came back. I hadn't given him the address. Daniel had reluctantly, after Ethan insisted it was about the divorce settlement, and not about winning me back. I should have known better than to believe that. I'd just gotten home from a long day on post, still in uniform, keys in hand, when I saw him standing at the bottom of the steps. He looked nothing like the man who'd texted me, "I finally have the family I always wanted," 2 weeks earlier. That confidence was gone. What stood in front of me was smaller, somehow hollowed out. "They're not mine," he said before I'd even reached the door. "I'm sorry," I told him, and I meant it. Not for him. For the 2 children caught in the middle of something they'd had no say in. He looked genuinely thrown by that, I think some part of him had driven over, expecting me to feel vindicated, maybe even a little triumphant. I didn't need that. I'd stopped needing anything from Ethan the day I read his handwriting on his mother's coffee table secondhand through a photograph Margaret sent me. He started talking fast the way people do when they're trying to outrun their own guilt. Claire, the affair. An apology that circled back on itself more than once. Then he said the thing that told me exactly how little had actually changed in him. Maybe this happened so we could find our way back. I looked at him for a long moment. Back to what he said. He knew he'd been wrong. He said he'd start therapy, get retested properly this time, that we could still look at IVF or donor conception or adoption, that none of it had to be the end of us. He said it like a man presenting options on a whiteboard, like the last 9 months could be reorganized into a plan. I let him finish, then I said the thing I'd been carrying since the diner outside Richmond. 9 years ago, if you'd put that report in front of me and said, "Nora, I'm scared," I would have held your hand through every test they wanted to run. He didn't say anything. If you'd told me we might never have biological children, I still would have stayed. I married you, Ethan, not a guarantee. He started crying standing there on the steps in the fading evening light, and for the first time in this entire unraveling, I felt something close to sympathy for him. Not enough to change anything, just enough to say what I said next without any anger in it. I didn't leave you because you might not be able to give me a child. I left because you could look at the woman you promised to love, watch her blame herself for 9 years, and decide your pride mattered more than telling her the truth. I told him the rest too, because he needed to hear all of it laid out plainly without softening. Claire had betrayed me, that was hers to carry. Margaret had kept a silence that wasn't fully her secret to keep, that was between her and her conscience, and she was already working through it. But none of that had made Ethan cheat. None of it had made him lie to me for almost a decade. None of it had made him build a second family with my own sister while I was still hanging hormone charts on our refrigerator. Those were choices, his alone, start to finish. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, and for a moment there was something almost boyish in the way he looked at me, hopeful in a way that made it clear he still didn't fully understand what he'd ended. "Yes," I said. He straightened. "Waiting. Sign the papers." That was all. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't invoke my rank or my command, or anything that would have turned this into a performance instead of what it actually was. The last boundary I had left to draw, and the only thing I still needed from him. He stood there a moment longer, like he was hoping I might reconsider if he just waited long enough. I didn't. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me gently. The way you close a door on a room, you have no reason to enter again. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. I walked away with what was legally mine. No dramatic courtroom reckoning. No judge punishing Ethan for the affair, the way things sometimes play out in movies, just a fair settlement that Daniel negotiated with the same calm precision he'd brought to every step of this. Some cases end in fireworks. Mine ended in signatures and a handshake in a conference room, and I found I preferred it that way. Claire moved closer to Ryan not long after the second paternity test confirmed what she'd suspected, but never checked. He was the twins' biological father, and the two of them began working out custody with more maturity than I would have guessed either of them had in them a year earlier. I didn't reconcile with my sister. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect these stories to end in forgiveness, tied up with a bow, and mine didn't, not with her. But I also didn't try to burn her life down on my way out of it. I simply stepped back. Some relationships don't end because you hate someone. I told her the one time we spoke after everything settled. They end because the trust's been spent, and there's nothing left to draw from. She didn't argue with me. I think by then she understood. Margaret apologized more than once in the months that followed. I didn't tell her I forgave her right away because I didn't, not yet, and I wasn't going to hand her something. I hadn't actually finished working through myself. Maybe one day, I told her. But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, it just decides what happens next. I left the door open between us. She'd earned that much in the end by choosing truth over her son's comfort when it mattered. I stayed in the army. That part of my life never wavered, not once through any of this. And I think that's what carried me through the worst of it. Having somewhere to go every morning that had nothing to do with fertility calendars, or wedding rings, or a marriage that had quietly rotted from the inside for almost a decade before I ever knew it. One morning, a few months after the papers were signed, I stood in the locker room after physical training, catching my breath, sweat cooling on the back of my neck. I caught my reflection in the mirror above the sink. No ring, no lingering ache in my chest when I thought about Ethan's name. No IVF calendar open on my phone. No silent apology forming in my throat, the way it used to unbidden whenever someone asked if we had kids yet. I'm sorry my body keeps failing us. I'd said that sentence, or some version of it, more times than I could count over 9 years. Standing there that morning, I realized I hadn't thought it once in months. And I understood finally what I'd actually been looking for all that time. It was never only a child. It was a family, where I didn't have to keep proving I belonged in it. Ethan had let me believe for 9 years that not being able to give him a biological child made me somehow less than whole. I understand now that the opposite was true. A marriage doesn't fail because two people run into a hard problem together. It fails when one of them decides a lie is easier to live with than facing that problem honestly side by side with the person who promised to stand there with him. I didn't chase any final act of revenge. I never sent the DNA results to his coworkers. I never tried to get him in trouble at his job. I never used my rank, my command, or anything I'd built over 11 years of service to make his life harder than it already was. I didn't need to. I simply stopped being the woman waiting in the wings of a life Ethan assumed would always be there when he wanted to come back to it. Months after the divorce, an email arrived from him, short, a few lines, nothing more. He said he'd started therapy. He said he was sorry, and this time it read differently than the apologies at my door, had quieter less about what he wanted from me, and more about what he'd finally understood. He wrote that he now knew I had never been the reason we couldn't build the family he wanted. I read it once. I didn't reply. I closed my laptop and looked out the window of my office, where a new group of soldiers was starting formation for the morning, their voices carrying faint and steady across the yard. I stood up, smoothed my uniform, and walked out to meet the day. For 9 years, I apologized for the family I couldn't give him. It took lowing my marriage to understand the truth. I was never the one who failed us. And the best revenge I ever gave Ethan wasn't watching his lies collapse in front of him. It was making sure I never carried another one of them again. If you were in my place, could you ever forgive a sister or a mother-in-law who stayed silent for 9 years? Tell me honestly in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, make sure you subscribe and stay close, because this is exactly the kind of journey we're here to walk through.